Hello, everyone. I'm your host, JP Robinson with Heroes and Villains, a bi-weekly podcast spotlighting the people of the world wars. A new episode of Heroes and Villains airs every other Tuesday. You can find Heroes and Villains on Spotify, Google Podcasts, and pretty much any other podcast platform, as well as my website, jprobinsonbooks.com. To those of you listening for the first time, welcome. I'd ask you all to share this podcast with friends, as the stories we talk about are truly worth hearing. So while most of you know that I focus on unique individuals of the World War I, World War II era, I've had the privilege lately of inviting several guest speakers to Heroes and Villains, and today I am honored to host retired Air Force historian, Dr. Daniel Haulman. Dr. Haulman, welcome.
Thank you very much.
To those of you who don't know Dr. Haulman, let me introduce him. He was born in New Orleans, where he attended public schools. He earned his PhD in history from Auburn University in 1983. He worked at the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base for 37 years, retiring in 2019 as head of the organization's Organizational History Section. He is the author of 9 aviation history books, published by the U.S. Air Force and by New South Books, as well as 43 periodical articles, 5 encyclopedia articles, and 15 articles published electronically. He has been historical advisor for 4 Tuskegee Airmen films, including 2 by George Lucas. Dr. Haulman is a member of the Society for Military History, the Alabama Historical Association, the Air Force Association, the Air Force Historical Foundation, the Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated, and the Sons of the American Revolution. Dr. Haulman has presented papers at more than 40 historical conferences. In 2021, he was selected by the Air Force Historical Foundation to receive its prestigious Dr. I.B. Hawley Award for a lifetime of achievement in the documentation of Air Force history. He is married to Ellen Ann Evans Haulman, and they have one son, Evan. Dr. Haulman, I don't know how you find time to do all of this.
Well, now that I'm retired, I have a little more time than I did.
Well, your contributions are amazing. So let's start. We're going to let you talk and really share with us, but let's start here. You've devoted a lot of time and energy into chronicling the story of the Tuskegee Airmen. What made you so passionate about this subject or Air Force history in general?
Well, it evolved slowly. I worked as you said, at the Air Force Historical Research Agency, which is the primary repository of Air Force historical documents. If you want to know about the units of Air Force history, squadrons or groups or wings, the Air Force Historical Research Agency is the best place to go. Back in 2006, I decided to focus on the 332nd Fighter Group, which was the black pilots known today as the Tuskegee Airmen. Back then, there were just the 332nd Fighter Group and its squadrons that flew in combat overseas. And my first article about the Tuskegee Airmen focused on the number of enemy aircraft they shot down. I determined that the 99th Fighter Squadron and later the 332nd Fighter Group, to which it was assigned, shot down a total of 112 enemy aircraft during World War II. And that was my first article about the Tuskegee Airmen. And it grew from there.
Wonderful. And, just hearing that in itself is really so inspiring for us, and to sit down and hear, especially given the fact that the Tuskegee Airmen were up against a lot of odds that a lot of fighter pilots did not have to face. And I think I may have read this in your book or one of your other books that you had a publication about it, but they had to fight for the right to fight for the country. And
yes, it did take a long time. That's right.
Yeah.
It took a long time for there to be more than one black flying unit. The first black flying unit was the 99th Pursuit Squadron, which later became the 99th Fighter Squadron. It took a while for the Army Air Forces and the War Department to activate other fighter squadrons, and then the 332nd Fighter Group, and then the 77th Bombardment Group and its 4 squadrons, which were the 10 black flying units in World War II. There were 10 if you count the 2 groups and the 8 squadrons. But they faced a lot of obstacles even before they deployed overseas. There was reluctance to send them overseas into combat. The 99th Fighter Squadron, for example, was constituted and activated in March of 1941, and it took 2 years for the 99th to actually deploy overseas in the spring of 1943. And then it took a while after that, not until early 1944, for the 332nd Fighter Group to be deployed overseas. with its 3 black fighter squadrons.
And
So they did face a lot of obstacles.
And all this while the war was on, and we needed the pilots. There was definitely a need, So, and to those of you listening in here and meeting or encountering Dr. Haulman for the first time, let me start off by saying that his work is so detailed and it is so much appreciated. Right now, I'm working on a manuscript that centers around the 99th. Dr. Haulman or a pilot in the 99th, and his work has been so helpful. He has a wonderful book that presents a visual history of the Tuskegee Airmen and just all the details that are and the emotions that are captured in these pictures that he's put together and so forth is very helpful. But Dr. Haulman, why don't you tell us now? I know you have another book that came out very recently, so why don't you tell us about that briefly, and then we'll get into the heart of what we're here to discuss today.
Okay, I've written more than one book about the Tuskegee Airmen. The first one that come out, I co-authored with Joe Caver and Jerome Ennals, who also worked at the Air Force Historical Research Agency. It's called the Tuskegee Airmen, an Illustrated History. Just a few years ago, a new book came out, the Tuskegee Airmen Chronology, which I authored by myself. And the latest book is Misconceptions About the Tuskegee Airmen, that focuses on 55 misconceptions about the Tuskegee Airmen that I encountered over the years as I've spoken about the Tuskegee Airmen and gone to different places. I've heard people raise questions, and sometimes I've seen in secondary sources some false claims, and I've addressed those in this new book.
Wonderful. And I think that, that's important for the historical record. And I think one of the ones that I've come across that you've successfully targeted has been the one that they never lost a bomber or something on that note. Is that correct?
That's right. That claim circulated for years and years, and I believed it too. And when I was doing my first article about the Tuskegee Airmen, I wasn't questioning that. I was looking at their aerial victory credits. But in the course of my research, I was looking at the mission reports and the narrative histories that the Tuskegee Airmen themselves wrote during World War II. And I discovered that there were documents that proved conclusively that sometimes there were bombers under Tuskegee Airmen escort that were shot down by enemy aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
And the Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated committee to determine just how many bombers were shot down. There were 27.
27. Yeah. And the thing is, with when time passes, I find that it's in many ways it's easy for myths to arise. It's easy for great men and great people that do great things to have things arise around them that aren't altogether accurate. But we need to stick true to that historical record at the same time. But it's to their credit. On the other hand, it's to their credit that this myth could even arise in the first place. I think it goes to show that they were exceptional in what they did in the first place.
Yes, they did lose significantly fewer bombers than the other groups. For example, they served in the 15th Air Force. The 15th Air Force had 21 bombardment groups. It had 7 fighter groups. And of those 7 fighter groups, the Tuskegee Airmen lost fewer bombers to enemy aircraft than the other groups. Wow. The number the Tuskegee Airmen lost, escorted bombers lost to enemy aircraft, I said was 27, but the average number lost by the other groups was 46. Wow. So they did lose significantly fewer bombers than the other groups.
Mm. Now that and that again is a great tribute in itself. All right, so Dr. Haulman, this podcast is called Heroes and Villains, and I know that you have a hero and a villain that was involved with the Tuskegee Airmen, 2 men that were involved, I believe, in their training and their development. So why don't you share with what you have about that? What can you tell us about a hero and a villain involved with the Tuskegee Airmen?
Sure, I'd be glad to talk about 2 of the white officers that led Tuskegee Airmen organizations or some of the Tuskegee Airmen during World War II. One of them was Colonel Noel Parrish. He was the commander of Tuskegee Army Airfield, where the basic and advanced flight training took place for the black pilots who flew the fighters and bombers, some of them in combat, some of them not in combat during World War II. But Noel Parrish is remembered by the Tuskegee Airmen, many of whom I've met at 8 different Tuskegee Airmen national conventions and also other places. I've known many Tuskegee Airmen over the years, some of whom have died recently. But they remember Noel Parrish as a hero. And the reason was because he was more willing than some of the other white officers who dealt with the Tuskegee Airmen in integrating the facilities at Tuskegee Army Airfield. And he was also supportive and encouraging of the Tuskegee Airmen training. He was definitely in favor of their success overseas, and he kept up with them. He even after World War II, he went to Air University at Maxwell Air Force Base and wrote a thesis when he was a student there just after World War II that advocated the full integration of the new Air Force. The Air Force, of course, was born after World War II. And because of his experience, he advocated the integration of the Air Force. The Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated even have an award that they present every year to one of their members, usually a veteran, Tuskegee Airman. And it's called the Noel Parrish Award, named after Colonel Noel Parrish. Now, he was the hero. Even though he was a white officer, he was remembered by the black trainees, and the military officers, the pilots who graduated from a basic and advanced flight training at Tuskegee Army Airfield, as a friend and supporter. On the other hand, there was another white officer who was the original commander of the 332nd Fighter Group and later became the commander of the 477th Bombardment Group, both Tuskegee Airmen organizations. Those organizations eventually became all black during World War II. But before they were all black, they had a white commander, Robert Selway. Now, Robert Selway, like Benjamin O. Davis Jr., the most famous Tuskegee Airman of all, attended West Point. But Robert Selway was not as amenable to evolving War Department regulations that recommended the integration of base facilities. So when he was commander of the 332nd Fighter Group at Selfridge Field, Michigan, for example, and many of the black pilots who trained at Tuskegee Army Airfield later went to Selfridge with the 332nd Fighter Group to train before they went overseas under Colonel Davis. But Selway wanted to keep the facilities segregated. And this is ironic because Noel Parrish was at Tuskegee Army Airfield in the South, willing to integrate the base facilities. Robert Selway was at the Selfridge Field in the North, and he was trying to keep things segregated on the base. The 332nd Fighter Group went overseas under black commander, Benjamin O. Davis Jr. Robert Selway became commander of the 477th Bombardment Group, which was not activated until after the 332nd Fighter Group went overseas to combat. So the 477th Bombardment Group was also at Selfridge. It later went to Godman Field, Kentucky, and then it went to Freeman Field. And at all those bases, Selway continued to insist on segregated facilities. At one of the reasons they moved away from Selfridge Field was because it was near Detroit. And there was, as you probably know, racial conflict, racial rioting at Detroit, which was near Selfridge. So that's one of the reasons I think that the 477th Bombardment Group moved to Godman Field, Kentucky. And they didn't have as much conflict over the Officers Club and the facilities on base at Godman Field because the white officers, including Selway himself, did not use the Officers Club and the recreational facilities at Godman Field. They went next door to Fort Knox. So it was kind of disguised there. When the 477th later went to Freeman Field in Indiana, they had a larger base, but they didn't have Fort Knox next door. So Selway decided, as he had at Selfridge, to have separate facilities. He pretended that the segregation was trainers and trainees, but that was just code words for black and white. He wanted white facilities and black facilities. He issued a regulation, a base regulation, that required those separate facilities for trainers, which were white, and trainees, which were black. And there was opposition. I don't want to get too much into detail about the Freeman Field Mutiny, what came to be called the Freeman Field Mutiny, but the gist of it is a total of 120 black officers demanded the integration of the Officers Club and the base recreational facilities at Freeman Field. And they were arrested in two waves. The first wave of 61 arrests were those who tried to enter the White Officers Club. And the second wave of arrest was 101 black officers who refused to sign the new base regulation. The reason I say there were 120 total arrested is some of them who were arrested in the first round were also arrested in the second round. So it's some of the same guys. So it was 120 black officers total who were arrested in the Freeman Field Mutiny because they protested the segregationist policies of Colonel Robert Selway. So he went down in history as the villain, whereas Noel Parrish went down in history as the hero.
You know, as you're looking at these, as you're sharing this here, my mind goes back to a film about the Tuskegee Airmen, and it wasn't recent. I think it was from like the 90s. And in that portrayal, which I'm sure you're familiar with, it in that portrayal, there are two officers that meet the new recruits that are coming in, and one of them is really kind of amenable. So it's kind of like what you're describing of Parrish, how you're portraying Parrish. And the other one is very hostile. The names of the characters are obviously changed, but I'm wondering if they were just trying to show that dichotomy, bringing the two men together in the same location and portraying that in there to kind of show the two different roles, that experiences that these men had.
They probably were. And just to give you another example, if you want another example, there was a white commander of the 33rd Fighter Group overseas, William Momire, was the colonel in command of the 33rd Fighter Group. When the 99th Fighter Squadron first went overseas, the 332nd Fighter Group was still training in the United States. So the 99th didn't have a fighter group to which it was assigned overseas. So it had to be attached to various white fighter groups that were already overseas, that already had 3 white fighter squadrons assigned to them. At the time, the 99th Fighter Squadron was flying P-40s. So it was assigned to various white fighter groups that had 3 squadrons of P-40s already assigned to it. One of those groups was commanded by William Momire, the 31st Fighter Group. I'm sorry, the 33rd Fighter Group. And the policy of Momire didn't like the idea of black pilots in a squadron attached to his group. And he tried to take them out of combat. Of course, if you look back at the documents, he doesn't say anything about race as being the reason. But he did say that they didn't perform as well as they should have performed, and he tried to take them out of combat and assign them far behind the lines so they wouldn't have opportunities in regular combat. They would be back behind the lines. His recommendation went all the way up to the leadership of the Army Air Forces. And the Army Air Forces and the War Department decided to study the issue. And they compared the 99th Fighter Squadron P-40 performance with the performance of the white P-40 fighter squadrons that were flying in the same Mediterranean theater. The results of the study came out in 1944, and it showed that the 99th was flying just as well as the other squadrons, P-40 squadrons in the Mediterranean theater in 1943 and early 1944. So they were kind of exonerated from that. They performed very well over Anzio. In 2 days, they shot down more enemy aircraft than the other squadrons with which they flew. But they were ultimately assigned to other groups with white commanders before they were assigned to the 332nd Fighter Group under Colonel Davis. And some of those other white fighter group commanders, like the commander of the 79th, were much more willing to provide equal opportunities to the black pilots, and they worked much better with those other commanders.
As you're going through that, and it's amazing to see how there were some that just had the differences of perspectives amongst the white commanding officers across the way. And I think that's very good, because that's very good to mention, because a lot of times when we think about the Tuskegee and we think about this time period, we don't realize that we focus a lot, unfortunately, on the racism and on the obstacles, but we don't realize that there were very good supportive men there that were really helping further this cause.
Yes,
do you think that go ahead?
I think one of them was General Aker. Major General Ira Aker was commander of the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces. And I think it was probably Aker more than anybody else who decided to take the 99th Fighter Squadron, assign it to the, by then, all-black 332nd Fighter Group, and change the mission. They were flying for the 12th Air Force, flying ground support missions. And after they were assigned to the 15th Air Force, under Aker's recommendation, they were able to escort bombers. They were one of 7 fighter groups to escort 21 bombardment groups from Italy, and that's where they had the opportunity to really shine. So Aker is one of those heroes, I think, who helped, a white officer who helps support the black pilots in their efforts.
So, and then speaking about bombers and escorts, can you tell us about the long flight that was taking? I think it was in March 24th or something on that order. It's one of the longest missions that was credited to the Tuskegees to the 332nd
Sure.
in escorting a series of bombers on a mission in Berlin.
Sure. On March 24th, 1945, was the only mission flown by the 15th Air Force to target Berlin. And of course, the 15th Air Force was mostly bomber groups, some fighter groups to escort the bombers. And they were bombing a lot of targets in Germany and in other countries in Central Europe under German occupation or allies of Germany, like Romania. And they were bombing those targets, but they usually didn't bomb Berlin because Berlin was bombed from England by the 8th Air Force. But in March 24, 1945, the 15th Air Force was given the assignment of bombing Berlin. And the Tuskegee Airmen were one of 5 of the 7 fighter escort groups that took part in the Berlin mission, the longest mission flown by the 15th Air Force, longest mission flown by the Tuskegee Airmen. And on that mission, 3 of the Tuskegee Airmen shot down jets over Berlin. And one of them was Roscoe Brown, a famous Tuskegee Airman who I had met. Of course, he's passed away now, but he was a good friend that I had over the years. And he had interesting stories to tell about his participation in the Berlin mission.
I'm sure he certainly did. Now, do you think that this was, were they intentionally selected for this? Was this just something that happened because they were escorting, or was this do you think this could have been because they had proven their reliability that they were chosen for this mission, or what was the background there?
Well, that's actually one of the misconceptions in my latest book, Misconceptions About the Tuskegee Airmen, is the misconception, and it's depicted in, I think, 2 movies, that HBO movie about the Tuskegee Airmen, and also in the Red Tails movie. I don't want to be too critical of the Red Tails movie because my name's in the credits. But the Red Tails movie isn't completely accurate. And one of the inaccuracies is the suggestion that the 332nd Fighter Group, the only black fighter group, fighter escort group on the Berlin mission, was there and the other group failed to show up. And they were the only fighter escort group to escort bombers over Berlin that day. That's not true. If you look at the documents, you look at the mission reports, you look at the 15th Air Force mission reports, the mission reports of all the groups involved, there were 5 fighter groups escorting bombers over Berlin that day. And the 332nd Fighter Group, as I said, shot down 3 jets that day. But the 31st Fighter Group, another fighter escort group in the 15th Air Force, was also shooting down jets over Berlin that day. They shot down 5 jets over Berlin. So the Tuskegee Airmen were heroic in the Berlin mission, but they were not the only group that were performing heroic missions that day.
And I appreciate you mentioning that, because that was actually one of my misconceptions until I heard you say that. The perception that I had was that, yep, these guys were the ones there and the other group didn't show up, just like you said, and they continued it on and carried this mission out. So it's wonderful to see that. And I think that keeping everything in perspective is what we need to do. Get the facts and keep it in perspective so that we have a truly accurate understanding of what everyone did that day in making this.
And behind every one of these misconceptions is some truth. You know, the Tuskegee Airmen did fly the Berlin mission. They did shoot down jets over Berlin. They just weren't the only group to do it. And to give you another example, I don't know if you've heard of Charles McGee.
Yes.
Charles McGee is a very famous Tuskegee Airman. He flew fighter combat missions with the 332nd Fighter Group in World War II. And then he flew in Korea, flew fighter jets in Korea. He flew fighter jets in Vietnam. And he flew a total of 409 combat missions, which is outstanding. The misconception is that that's higher than any other Air Force pilot who flew fighters in those 3 wars. There were at least 2 other fighter pilots of the Air Force that also flew in those 3 wars that have higher than 409 combat missions. I'm not trying to denigrate Charles McGee in any way. He was a good friend of mine before he died last year at the age of 102. And but I do want to say that sometimes the 409 combat missions, which is outstanding, is claimed to be the highest total of any Air Force pilot, and it's not.
Yeah, no, and I certainly, I know you're not trying to denigrate him, and I think that's wonderful to say it, because you know what, it's giving him the credit he deserves, but we also want to make sure we're giving every other pilot the credit they deserve, because every single person that was there sacrificed so much, to protect freedom, protect liberty, and I think that definitely needs to give credit to where it's due. So thank you so much for that. Okay, and Dr. Haulman here now, as we get ready to wrap up here today, again, everyone listening in, if you're coming in here later in the podcast, just remember this is Dr. Daniel Haulman, who is a retired Air Force historian and is doing a fantastic job illuminating and sharing with us about the Tuskegee Airmen. Dr. Haulman, my last question to you today is, in looking at all that we talked about, and in looking at everything that's we've seen of heroes, villains, etc., what lesson do you think we can all learn from this? Like, what's one takeaway that you think we should, in looking at this, draw from all we've said and done and walk away with?
Well, I think one of the lessons definitely is that racial discrimination makes no sense at all. And that given equal opportunities, people perform regardless of what race they are. I think sometimes we focus too much on what one race has done to another race, and not as much on what the races have done for each other and with each other against common enemies. And I think that's one of the lessons we can conclude, because no telling how many bomber crew members' lives were saved by Tuskegee Airmen. And so it was blacks doing things for whites and whites doing things for blacks as far as the training, because most of the flight instructors at Tuskegee Army Airfield who were training the black pilots were white. So it was a mutual support. And I think the ultimate contribution of the Tuskegee Airmen was to encourage the Air Force and other services to integrate, because there was no rational reason to keep the races apart and have separate training for blacks from whites and to have separate units.
Even from a financial perspective, I can't imagine the financial repercussions of that, as well as all the other aspects that come to it. Dr. Haulman, those are wonderful words. I really appreciate them, and it is indeed the truth. I think it's better to focus on what one has done for the other than what one has done to the other. I think that's a wonderful way to conclude this. Ladies and gentlemen, this is JP Robinson and Dr. Daniel Haulman here on Heroes and Villains. Again, I encourage you to check out Dr. Haulman's work. His books are available on Amazon. There are going to be sell links in the chat as well. Sell links in the provided here as well. And of course, you can look him up online and find his works. Thank you so much for joining us here today. This is JP Robinson, and we'll see you here next time on Heroes and Villains.